all came last day, but I've been here since Tuesday. It's been nice to get to know everybody here, say hello, and in many cases put a face to an email. And today's sharing is very nice because it's between this intimate group of people who are doing this retreat, and all of you, I think, know something about the autobiography of a yogi. As I like to say, in the autobiography, there are many examples of great statements. And Yogananda's way was to understate things and let us figure out the deepest meanings behind the sentence as we went along the spiritual path. But there's a particular one that comes to my mind right now, and it's from the chapter, perhaps the longest chapter in the autobiography of a yogi, Years in My Master's Hermitage, where Yogananda describes about his time with Sri Yukteswar, who wasn't easy to get along with. This is very interesting, you know, if you listen to all the talks Ananda people talk about, one of the consequences of spiritual progress is being able to get along with others easily. You know, that's one of the things we say is a hallmark of spiritual progress, not necessarily the hours you spend meditating and whether you see the inner light, so on and so forth, unless it also makes light manifest through our consciousness in our interaction with others. And here Yogananda's guru probably did not fall under that category of easy to get along with person, because he could be very strict with his disciples, not with everybody. And the story goes that some of Yukteswar's disciples came to Yogananda and wanted Yogananda to be his guru. And Yogananda said, you go to others if you want, I stay with my guru. But he also said, because these same people said to Yogananda, it's very hard for us to comprehend Sri Yukteswar's nature. And Yogananda's answer is, that's because you are not self-realized yet. It's only when you become self-realized that you can tune into a master completely. And the reason I say this also is the autobiography of a yogi was written by such a liberated soul. And so we will understand some things, we will find some things difficult to understand. And because I'm assuming you all have read this book, I might make references to sections in it again and again. One thing which I have never understood, and if you have some thoughts on this, you can tell me about it after thinking. Here, let me drink some water. Is Sri Yukteswar's next mission. You know, he's the master who was hard to understand when he was living and hard to understand even after he's moved into the here on. So according to the autobiography of a yogi, Sri Yukteswar's mission is he helps those who go to this high astral planet called Hiranyaloka advance spiritually, take their next steps. But the qualification for reaching that planet is you have to attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is the highest level of spiritual attainment. And why somebody who reaches that state still needs help progressing further is something I have never been able to understand. Because you know, you're one with the infinite when you reach that state, and Sri Yukteswar is sort of born as a guide for those who have reached that state. So anyway, I asked that question to Devarshi once, and he said, you know, a lot of the things on the spiritual path, Nayaswami Devarshi, who heads the Kriya Sangha, are on a need-to-know basis. And some of these answers wouldn't help us where we are right now. But that said, there are certain things that stand out when you think deeply about things that are mentioned there. Overall, Autobiography of a Yogi is a very joyful book, and today's talk is very interesting. It's not just about the autobiography, but how it relates to the science of yoga in the modern age, which is in today's times. And I have a few thoughts which I want to share. This perhaps is one of the favorite books for me because I read it when I was 7 years old. My family had some kriya-yogis. This book found its way into my home. I love to read, and so I read this book and many others by Yogananda. And the beautiful thing was, it was understandable. The English is a bit hard. If that hurdle can be crossed, the ideas are a pure delight for a child of 7, 8 or 9. It's like Alice in Wonderland, quite literally, but true wonders. It's not just something somebody's created. If you remember, a lot of this book, the first chapters are of Yogananda at the same age as I was when I read that book, 5, 7, 9, 11. And a master can relate. He brings the consciousness he's supposed to bring into a story. So the way he narrates those stories with the surprises, analogies, his thoughts, the way he prayed, the way he received answers, match those of somebody who is at that age, 5, 7, 9, 11. As you go through this, his mother passed away when he was very young, and his expression of grief at that age is not somebody who was of 40, 45 years. 1945 is when he completed this book, but he started writing this book several years ago. He wrote it in sections, so he was probably in his 40s when he wrote this book. But it's not a 40-year-old person ruminating on his conscious experiences when he was 12. He literally becomes like that child when he talks about those stories. And so it's very relatable. I say this also because if you have children, it's a fun exercise to take certain snippets and read it to them. And you'll probably see how nicely, if the right snippets are taken, if they can't read it by themselves, they will take to the universal principles that are in this book. Now that is one sign of its universality, that it doesn't know a barrier of age really, if people can just surmount the barrier of language. But there are a few other things that are worth talking about from the point of view of the science of yoga. Yoga is an ancient science of self-realization, and fortunately or unfortunately, it has many elements to it. There's no one element that covers that word yoga when used as a science. Yoga is both a state and it's also the science that leads to that state. This is classic in Sanskrit or in this spiritual path. The same words represent the goal and also the discipline that leads to the goal. So yoga represents the state of self-realization and the science that leads to that. Being a Swami represents the state of having reached that state where you are a Swami, and also somebody who aspires sincerely to reach that state. And so on. At pranayama, it represents the techniques that take you to that state of pranayama where you have control over your life force. So this is something that is often common here. But the science of yoga has many aspects to it. And the beauty of the autobiography of a yogi is it brings all those aspects into focus without leaving one out, without overemphasizing another, and makes us want to reach that state of self-realization. So it's not just informational, it does not just give information, but it inspires us to reach to that state. The first thing which I like to talk about is the title of the book. Because it's called Autobiography of a Yogi, and I was saying this in New Zealand because that's when this thought came to me, is Yogananda could have called, all this is his autobiography, let's say. He could have called it many different things. A master has no self-definition. He takes on personality to act. But if he had to choose one self-definition, there were many things he could have said. He could have called it Autobiography of an Indian, Autobiography of a master, because he was a master, Autobiography of a disciple, Autobiography of a meditator, Autobiography of a kriya-yogi. But instead of all of those, he decided to choose one word. If he was to define himself as anything, he chose to be a yogi. And a yogi is somebody who doesn't have any other self-definitions but wants to reach the state of yoga. Again, very universal. See, this is something, in the modern age, people don't want something that makes them feel that they are a sect or they belong to something that's exclusive. Being a yogi is any Christian, any Muslim, any Jewish person, if they are sincerely seeking answers, can aspire to be. Now, when I was saying this in New Zealand, somebody asked, "Can I be a yogini?" And I says, "Of course, that's perfectly fine, because yogi is used oftentimes in both ways, for irrespective of the gender, but yogini is fine also, of course." The other thing to remember, because I said there's many aspects to the spiritual path. Some of these you know and we'll talk about. But the question arises, what is the most important aspect of the spiritual path? Again, we like to have more important, less important, this is just us, we like to do these things, so maybe you guys can indulge me in this. There is techniques, there is grace, there is devotion, there is practices of meditation, paths of yoga. What else constitutes? There's one more element to the yogic path which makes it sort of the most important for us. And I haven't said it yet. Maybe somebody would like to guess what that element is. And if you can't, I'll give you a hint. Remember, this wasn't the original name of this book, Autobiography of a Yogi. It was supposed to be called something else. And then Yogananda chose this name. Yogi Christs of India. That was the name Yogananda was first going to call this book. And why I'm choosing that is, in a way, the most important element of the yogic path is those who have reached that state and show us by example that that state can be reached. And this is how somebody who has reached that state looks like. It's those liberated souls that give us inspiration to do everything else. We then follow in their footsteps. Jesus, there's a reason why the greatest religions have been started not by scholars, but by self-realized souls who have seldom written a book on their own. Others who have seen the inspiration they bring try to follow, and out of that a religion often gets formed. But the Buddha, the Christ, and Moses, you name it, there's many others, and we have a few hundred in India who would fit the bill. But every place, we have those self-realized souls. And this Autobiography of a Yogi, because it lists so many great souls and inspires us with their sense of freedom, that is an important reminder to us, because we are talking about the path of yoga in modern times. Path of yoga is different from a school of yoga. A school of yoga can be started by anybody with teachings, with techniques, but we are trying to reach self-realization, and that the guiding light comes from the masters, those who have reached that state of self-realization themselves. This is where the concept of a lineage comes into play. And then, as I was thinking about that, I realized also what Yogananda did was far more. He didn't just talk about saints, but by giving the examples of many saints in this book, he also sort of told us what the marks of the highest level of sainthood are. Because if you remember, there's some chapters here where Yogananda says, this person, he had something. There was some spiritual element to his understanding, manifestations, but just by the words he said or the way he responded, he hadn't yet reached the highest level. There's one example here of the perfume saint, classical example there, where Yogananda meets this great soul who has gone to Tibet for 20 years and learned how to impart perfumes, fragrances to anything. And he generally does it for flowers. And Yogananda finally says to him, you spent 20 years learning something that I could buy from a vendor right away with 1 rupee or 2 rupee, In Yogananda wrote these series of lessons called Precepta, which were the lessons that SRF used to send out in the early days. And those lessons are compilations. They weren't. Yogananda never wrote any lessons. And the reason I say it is there's a lot of things about, does Ananda have the lessons written by Yogananda or does SRF? None of them do. Everything was compiled from what Yogananda shared. But those lessons have many of the stories Yogananda would narrate in his classes and from India. And the delightful story I'm reminded of is a young boy tells his family he's leaving the spiritual path. He's leaving the family to go to the Himalayas, find a guru, meditate, and then come back with liberation. And so he goes for a few years and he comes back. And after his father is very proud, my son has become a yogi. He's very happy because he's very high-minded. You know, he was fine when the son said he's leaving, he's come back. But then he hears from all his friends about the greatness of his son. And he starts getting worried and he calls his son and says, "Son, how come I'm hearing all these stories about you having been so great? Oh, Dad, I'll show you. Let's go to the river. I'll show you what I can do." And he said, "See, this river is so wide, you know, probably the Ganges or one of those. I'll walk across it to the other bank and come back. And the villagers have been seeing me do this, and that's why they are so impressed at what I can do." And so he shows him. He walks to the other bank and comes back. And of course, the dad starts crying. And, "Oh my God, you wasted your life, you idiot." You know, he says, "What the heck have you been doing?" He says, "What are you talking about, Dad? I just, look at what I did." "Well, I do this by paying the boatman every morning for 25 cents. You know, he takes me to the other side and brings me back. And you wasted your 10 years of your life just learning to do the same thing." But those stories that Yogananda had are often forgotten because we remember the great miracles in the Autobiography of a Yogi. But that groundedness, which is very much a part of the science of yoga, but which sometimes get overemphasized, especially in today's world, he showed by a careful, repeated reading of this book that the science of yoga is much more than that. But then he didn't just leave it there. In addition to having the greatest of saints and the example of that state of complete self-realization, he did a few more things. He talked about techniques of meditation, very important. He talked about kriya-yoga, you know, which he said is the jet plane route to God. And the example he gave was very delightful. In this book, there are many places where kriya-yoga is talked about. But here's a fun thing to do someday if you want to dive into this book in a new way. Just read the footnotes sometimes, you know, and see, because Yogananda often has to explain new terms, which are Sanskrit terms, to a universal audience. And the way he explains them often gives joy, because the chapter on Kriya Yoga is, I think, chapter 26. But Kriya Yoga is mentioned in the first page or two of this book. So he hasn't yet talked about Kriya, but he's using that term, so he has to explain its meaning as a footnote. And I like the footnote he's used here because it's a very good definition of Kriya Yoga. So for example, the first time he talks about, on the first page, he uses the word yogi. And he has a footnote there because nobody knows what yogi means. Here's how he puts it: a practitioner of yoga union, ancient Indian science of meditation on God. Just very nice. But when he talks about Kriya Yoga, this is when Yogananda's parents are initiated by Lahiri Mahashaya as a disciple into Kriya Yoga. That's when he uses that word for the first time. And here's the footnote he puts with that word: a yogic technique whereby the sensory tumult is stilled, permitting man to achieve an ever-increasing identity with cosmic consciousness. And when I read that, I thought that's a very good definition of the science of yoga. But he talks about techniques here, but he also puts those techniques into right perspective with the other elements of the science of yoga. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how he explains Kriya Yoga in this particular chapter. It's called Two Penniless Boys in Vrindavan. Somebody here said, who said it's their favorite chapter? Somebody on Zoom the other day said that it's their favorite chapter. Is that somebody here? Probably it was her. Well, at the very end, that chapter ends with a Kriya Yoga initiation, right? Here's how he puts it. He gives Kriya to a particular student of his who has seen Yogananda in a vision and has come to meet Yogananda at the particular spot where in his vision he saw his teacher. And so Yogananda gives him Kriya and says, this technique, which as you see is simple, embodies the art of quickening man's spiritual evolution. Hindu scriptures teach that the incarnating ego requires a million years to obtain liberation. This natural period is greatly shortened through Kriya Yoga. Just as Jagdish Chandra Bose had demonstrated that plant growth can be accelerated far beyond its normal rate, so man's psychological development can also be speeded by an inner science. And just that simple example, because he had in the previous parts of this book talked about J.C. Bose, who had shown how plant growth could be accelerated. Those of you who have read about Luther Burbank, whom Yogananda talks about, he did the same thing. You get trees that were 5 years old to reach the maturity of a tree that was 25 years old and bear fruits. And the walnut tree, which I have yet to see, but I'm sure Pranava has been there and seen it, it's in Santa Rosa in California. So he used to say, if plants can be made to grow faster, why can't human beings evolve faster than what is a quote-unquote normal pace? And we often go at a subnormal pace because we add our own complexities to that equation. So he talks in this particular great scripture about techniques, which is something everybody can use. We all have the same nervous system, and that nervous system is often nervous. It makes us nervous, which is the problem. It's funny, it's called the nervous system, and the word nervous also means these other things which we don't want to be. We want to be steady. But we have these nerves, and life force gets distributed into the 5 senses through these nerves. And because we, irrespective of our nationality, gender, race, upbringing, traditions, belief systems, we all have that same nervous system. The science of yoga teaches us how to withdraw life force from that nervous system and settle it in the spine, and then, as Yogananda said, in the brain. And so it's a universal science. But he doesn't just talk in this great book, even though he talks about Kriya Yoga so highly. The book is filled with all the other elements of the spiritual path, the masters, the technique, but devotion. This book oozes devotion, like when I read this book, probably that is what charmed me, that Yogananda, when he prayed very deeply, and even as a child, before he had received Kriya Yoga even, and he would receive this divine response. And that divine response was given to him not because he could bring something in return, it wasn't a bargain with God where Yogananda would do a great work and that's why God responded. He was just a little boy at that time. But he had that attunement and he had that closeness which he had established with God, and as a result of it, all his answers were received. There are many examples in this book, by the way, of saints who didn't necessarily have techniques of meditation, but whose primary emphasis was that devotional approach. Now, their guru might have given them other practices. Anandamayi Ma is one, and Master Mahashaya in this great book is another, who was just like a little child in front of Divine Mother, and Divine Mother was always in conversation with him. In fact, when I was in New Zealand, somebody was talking to me. And the talk, as can happen in group dynamics, things can get complex. Even when many good people come together, it's not always that everybody is on the same wavelength. We learn the same at Ananda Village also. We have to learn what the right thing that's trying to happen is, and we have to find a harmonious way forward. And so this person, they asked me, can we go on a walk? And they were telling something about another person who was creating waves, which happens sometimes. And it was disturbing the group dynamic. And I was saying, oftentimes prayer helps wonderfully in these situations. And by prayer, it doesn't mean a particular request that do this or intercede. It's more like just a conversation with God. I need a little help here. This is a complex situation. Is there a way it can be resolved so that everybody is happy, kind of thing? And the example that came to my mind was from this great book, because Yogananda was with Master Mahashaya, who was Ramakrishna's devotee, and they were walking together. And suddenly this person who was a gossip monger, who just liked to talk, showed up amongst them and just started talking to Yogananda non-stop. And Yogananda was clutching his brow and he was like, here I could be with this great yogi, and instead I'm having to answer all these mundane questions. But he didn't say anything outwardly. But Master Mahashaya caught that and whispered to him, I see this person does not please you. I have mentioned our sad predicament to Divine Mother. She's in full sympathy with our situation and has said that as soon as we reach that house, red house, which is up there, this person will depart. And Yogananda says his eyes were glued to that place of salvation. That's how he called it. And as soon as they reached there, without completing the sentence, this person just departed. But the beauty is that childlike relationship. See, it's not, there are many yogic books. Some of you have probably explored other paths. And no, I'm not trying to put them down. Which are technique heavy, which are information heavy, which are complex terms heavy. As if by so doing, we are supposed to get a deeper experience of yoga. But the autobiography of a yogi is not like that. It's everything. The deepest techniques, the deepest expressions of freedom, with the simple childlike conversation with Divine Mother that brings miracles to happen, And Yogananda would give many stories. There's another one here of the three hermits. And remember what happens there? A missionary goes to these three hermits and tells them, your prayer, we are three, thou art three, have mercy on us, something like that. That's crazy, it's undignified. Let me teach you all the canonical prayers. And he teaches them, and they are like, yeah, of course, we were only doing what we knew. You know better, so please, we are happy to learn from you. And so he's gone to their island, and then he teaches them everything, and he departs. And as he's gone halfway, he looks back and he sees this blazing light following that the boat. And then he sees these three people walking, running on water, hand in hand in that light. And they come to him and fall at his feet and say, I'm so sorry, we are so sorry. We forgot your prayers and ran here to ask you to repeat them before you went away. And the guy says, continue with what you are doing. You don't need these formal prayers. But it's important because we can get lost in the techniques. Every spiritual path has a pitfall. And the path that has many techniques has the pitfall that we get lost in those techniques. And so, autobiography of a yogi in a nice way. Again, as I said, these are understated. Unless we focus on these things, we won't realize that Yogananda is making these points again and again. I've already given two or three examples, and there's several others where devotion transcends techniques. But that apart, there's also grace, where the divine hand is always with us, even when difficult situations happen. Yogananda's guru, his mother had to be taken away from him, when he was, and his mother was his universe. He had a very deep bond with his mother, and that had to happen. When Yogananda was a school headmaster, his pet deer was taken away from him. So it's not as if, and later in his life, it's not in the books, he had heartaches in the sense of betrayals. He had to fight lawsuits, all those things. But even within those experiences, there is again and again that manifestation of divine grace. And Yogananda finally, most as importantly, also talks, and I don't know if I'm covering everything Pranava thinks.
Yeah, he does this really well. He covers everything.
And yet Pranava finds something to share. But just to end, he talks about all the great masters. He talks about grace, he talks about devotion, he talks about technique, but then the capstone of it all is not just all masters, but the one that was sent to him, the guru-disciple relationship, the lineage that brings us to freedom. So anyway, just to say, this book has the entire essence of the path of yoga in it, written in a way that inspires, that brings joy, that's non-denominational, that lays the highest possibilities that can be achieved, while making it all seem achievable and something we can aspire to. So I think for somebody who basically this was his first book, he had written small books, I must say he did really well.